All right, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
My name is Sakira Cook. I'm a senior counsel at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. We're the nation's premier civil and human rights coalition, representing about 200 national organizations that are working together to build an America as good as its ideals. Today's panel discussion on the impact of arrest and jail policies on women and families will look at the profound changes in the involvement of women in the justice system over the past quarter century as a result of more expansive law enforcement efforts, stiffer drug sentencing laws, and post-conviction barriers to reentry. It's my pleasure to welcome our esteemed group of panelists and experts. Today, we are missing one person who is coming. They just landed, Delta challenges. So Vivian Nixon will join us in a few moments. But it's my pleasure to welcome Diane Goldstein to my immediate left, Elizabeth Savola from the Vera Institute, and Andrea James. I will ask each of them, just going down the line, to introduce themselves and their organizations and tell us a little bit about their work before we get into the discussion. Thank you. Diane?
My name's Diane Goldstein, and I'm a board member.
Because the door can't be closed. There's a lot of conflicting noise.
Sure.
Oh, and just as an FYI, we are live streaming, so please put your phones on vibrate and all of that good stuff. Thanks.
My name's Diane You know what? I'm going to put the mic closer to my mouth. My name's Diane Goldstein, and I'm a retired lieutenant commander from Redondo Beach Police Department in California, having served almost 22 years in law enforcement. I'm currently a board member for Law Enforcement Action Partnership, formerly Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, who has been working since 2002 to end the failed drug war. And literally in January, we went through a revisioning where we now are also working in the fields of harm reduction, civil asset forfeiture reform, mass incarceration, police accountability and reform, and community relations.
Thanks, Diane. Elizabeth?
Great. Hi, I'm Liz Savola. I'm a senior program associate at the Vera Institute of Justice with the Center on Sentencing and Corrections. At Vera, we study problems in justice systems and produce evidence and data to drive effective policy and practice. At the Center on Sentencing and Corrections, we partner with local jurisdictions to study their use of their local jails and to look at, over time, how the jail population has grown. And we offer recommendations for safely reducing the jail population. Our work currently is in Oklahoma and Washington states, as well as sites that are participating in the Safety and Justice Challenge, which is an initiative of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation to reduce over-incarceration by changing the way America thinks about and uses its jails. So in partnership with the Safety and Justice Challenge, my colleagues at Vera and I set out to write a report called Overlooked: Women and Jails in an Era of Reform, to better understand the dramatic growth of the number of women in jail since the 1970s. We found that there's been a 14-fold increase between 1970 and 2014. And what we found is that the research on women in jails is incredibly dated and scarce. But we do know is that women in jails are disproportionately women of color. They are overwhelmingly from poor and low-income communities, and they are mothers, almost 80%. They've also experienced very high rates of trauma, substance use, and other behavioral health challenges. And so really, because so many of them are mothers, their incarceration really has an outsized impact on their families, but also on their communities.
Thanks, Liz. Andrea?
Hi, I'm Andrea James, and just to get our name of our organization right, I'm from the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. We are the women and girls that everybody is speaking about. And we're a national organization now made up of women, individuals, and organizations, all currently and formerly incarcerated women and girls who have joined together in a national movement to make sure that our voices are included going forward in the dialogue around meaningful criminal justice reform, prison abolition, how we better shape our communities so that we can stop the flow of our loved ones, our families into incarceration. We unapologetically focus on women and girls. And we have, right here in this room, we have about 7 states represented from council members that have joined us today around this very important issue. And our mantra is nothing about us without us. We don't feel as though these conversations should be had without the women and the girls who are most directly affected as the experts, using our voices, using our lived experiences, and using our creative brilliance of how to get to our goal, which we mean when we say to end incarceration of women and girls. So it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. So Liz, I want to start with you. And you gave us a great sort of backdrop, about the research your organization has done and sort of the status of women in jails and prisons in this country. But can you go a bit more in detail about the policies that have led to this growth and sort of what is unique about the experience of women based on the research that you have done?
Sure. So when we set out to kind of explore this growth, what we found is there's very little out there explaining why the number of women in jails has grown so dramatically. But what we were able to cobble together from whether it was federal research or state and local is that there are several factors I think that emerge as contributing to the growth. So first, at the very front end, policing practices have come to increasingly focus on low-level, nonviolent offenses, and these tend to be the charges that bring women into the justice system. So policies like broken windows policing that focus on quality of life offenses, low-level drug possession, loitering, disorderly conduct, things like that. At the same time, that converged with, as we heard this morning, the ongoing war on drugs. Drug law enforcement became increasingly punitive and really swept many women up into the system, even if they had very minimal involvement in whatever happened. Kind of at the next step in the process, once women become involved in the system, it's incredibly destabilizing and disruptive. Policies that may, on the surface, appear gender neutral can actually disadvantage women to an even greater extent than men, such as the use of cash bail, excessive fines and fees. And those practices can really work to trap women in the system. And a lot of the decision-making really isn't individualized and doesn't take into account many of the disadvantages that women have faced. Moreover, when they are incarcerated in jail, it can be incredibly traumatizing. As we heard, almost 90% of women in jails have experienced sexual violence. Many have experienced domestic violence and experienced violence as children as well. And so the being in jail, being supervised by male officers, being shackled, being searched, can all really re-trigger a lot of that trauma. And then as they move even further into the system, they're really not supported in being successful as they seek to leave the justice system. So whether it's through reentry or community supervision, programs are often not designed for women. They're designed for men, who are the majority of those in the system. And that can be incredibly difficult for women to navigate. They're often left on their own to figure out how do you navigate your criminal justice responsibilities as well as family and employment and other social services. It can be incredibly confusing, and oftentimes requirements of those different systems might even conflict with each other. So it can be very hard to be successful. And then finally, we're in this moment where criminal justice and jails are getting a lot of attention. And we've seen in the population of men in jail that it started to trend downward ever so slightly, while the population of women just continues to grow and very rapidly. And so I think that really suggests that even as we are thinking about reforms and innovative new programs, they're just not reaching women to the same extent that they're reaching men.
Thank you. Diane, I want to go to you, and I want you to dive in a little bit deeper around some of what Liz, sort of laid out for us, and talk about the ways that law enforcement can be partners in reform, and how, while also, sort of maintaining quote unquote public safety, because that is a big concern for a lot of people, although I think people often have different definitions of public safety, and we should explore that. I don't know if we're going to get in that today, but definitely something for us to discuss as we talk about reform efforts. But Diane.
Sure. I think that there's several issues. Our organization is made up of current, former, and retired criminal justice professionals that cover the spectrum, very similar to the Brennan Center law enforcement leaders of, we have former state prosecutors, we have federal prosecutors, we have police chiefs, correctional officers, the broad spectrum, drug enforcement agents that all believe that the drug war has been a significant failure, and in fact, second to slavery in our country, that the drug war itself has been the most significant criminal justice failure in our society now. And so at our roots, we believe that ending the drug war and treating drug use, substance abuse, strictly from a public health policy is badly needed, and we are not going to reform the criminal justice system completely until that happens. I think for me personally, I just finished my master's degree at UCI, and one of my themes through the last 2 years of research that is critically important, we need to redefine what public safety means. We as a society, we as citizens, we as organizations that we're finally starting to take it back in the last few years, we have abdicated who's responsible for public safety. And the criminal justice professionals have taken it and used that for entrenched self-interest, policing for profit, private prisons, drug testing. I can name every significant governmental policy that we have has been impacted by the drug war. And so I think it's critically important as we talk about it as panelists here is that we need to redefine what community safety is. It's not public safety, it's community health and safety. And law enforcement should not be the biggest fiscal proponent of it. I like to use the analogy, we have 4 tires on a car. And right now we have overinflated the criminal justice tire, and it's going to blow. And it's causing all these ripple effects. So we need to very clearly put in mental health programs, drug treatment on demand, drug decriminalization. We need to start funding reentry programs. We need to defelonize crime. We need to decarcerate and reduce admissions, not just into the prison system, but the county jail system. And one way of doing that is by holding local counties responsible fiscally for how many people they send into the state prison system. And I think that there's ways of doing that by enhancing public safety. Our organization believes that we need to address the underlying symptoms that cause trauma, that cause people to turn to drugs, that cause people to sell drugs. Everything that I see, all our research is we have socioeconomic issues, we have poverty, we have all these things that we give to law enforcement to fix, and we can't fix it. But we also, from a law enforcement perspective, need to release that control and release those funds that are more cost efficient and more cost effective in preventing crime. So I talked about reducing admissions to county jails and prisons. One way that law enforcement can support, revitalizing the system is we need to support federal sentencing reform. We need to move away from the tough on crime political ideology and rhetoric that we are hearing right now. And we need to not be apathetic, and we need to call our senators and our congressmen across both sides of the aisles and say, we are not going to put up with it anymore. We need to increase pre-diversion booking programs, not drug-mandated programs, but there are law enforcement assisted diversion programs springing up across the country that are made up of bipartisan organizations that include social support, where instead of sending low-level women who are maybe sex workers in order to feed their family. Rather than sending them to jail, we send them to wraparound services, and we provide them with mental health training, parenting, drug treatment on demand. And so law enforcement assisted diversion is springing up across the country. Seattle Police Department, Seattle and King County started it. And what we see with that is people who are in that type of pre-diversion booking, they're not even being booked, they're not being sent to court. 58% of the clients in Seattle and King County are not committing more crimes. So we know investing in people, investing in parents, investing in moms, investing in their children will do wonders for our society. So that's, a couple of the different ways that I think we can do it.
Thanks, Diane. Andrea, I want to go to you and pick up on something that Diane mentioned with regards to trauma and attacking the root causes of and the symptoms of what we see sort of in the justice system. Can you talk a bit about the experience of women, especially the women that you all work with that are part of the council, whose experience sort of sit at the fore of this, and about how that differs from men and their experiences, but also the ways that you all think that we can address this problem at the root and sort of get to what Diane was discussing a bit earlier.
Well, certainly when you talk about the population of incarcerated women, trauma is one of the common threads that run through the lives of women. But there's a lot of common threads that we are not really addressing. And Diane touched upon some of that in terms of what's happening in our communities, and particularly around this issue of criminal justice reform and the uptick in dialogue around this. There's a contradiction that's happening because those of us who are really in the mud doing this work from within the communities that are most vulnerable, that live there, that have experienced living in a prison as women, as mothers, and that is never, ever going to be the place for women to begin to heal and advance their lives. When we talk about things that cause further harm, sending women to prison, particularly women who are mothers, causes further harm. And those places aren't places that are conducive for the healing of things such as trauma. And the underlying things that we really hope people begin to understand around this conversation. We say, yes, stop incarcerating women. There is nothing that we can say about what happens inside of jails and prisons that is going to get us to a place of putting these women in a space where they can re-enter and pick up the pieces of their lives. A lot of that has to do with, and let me not skip over that because prison environments are horrific. Mm-hmm. They're awful places. They are places of Senator Kamala Harris touched upon a lot of the things that are happening inside of prisons to women. They are separated from their children. If you have ever been on a prison bunk at 3 o'clock in the morning, laying next to a woman who is inconsolable because of what is happening on the outside to her children, it is something that you will never forget. We have a feeling, or we somehow in this country, that when we separate mothers who love their children dearly, even mothers who aren't active in the children's lives prior to their incarceration, even those women who are struggling beyond some of the most imaginable difficulties that any human being should ever be forced to have to try and live through. These women love their children, and they carry into that prison space the heaviness of that separation of mothers and children. It's a dual sentence. You cannot just sentence a woman who is a mother to incarceration for something that has been perceived by society as a crime, and then expect her not to have this very heaviness, an extra incarceration of the burden of worrying about how her children are surviving on the outside. It is not true that when we separate mothers from children and incarcerate them, that the lives of their children get better. The lives of their children do not get better. It causes further harm. We must get to the core of really pushing for criminal justice reform that stops incarcerating women. And once they're there, again, their living conditions are horrific. Prisons were built for men. The families do not have access or resources to connect the mothers with their children. There are limits on visits. There is not the ability to speak to your children and engage in their lives. Mothering from a prison payphone is impossible. And so those are some of the things that we know as women who have lived in a prison and been separated from our children, what that is like. There is nothing good that comes out of that. We have to come out and we have to deal with, in addition to whatever guilt, whatever heaviness, whatever difficulties in re-entering just as this single human being, we also have to carry with us the guilt and the heartache of time that we will never get back away from being with our children. And the harm, too often, the numbers, the high percentages of daughters of incarcerated women that are being trafficked as we speak today, while their mothers are sitting on a prison bunk. So we really have to get to those very important issues. And my concern is that recently there have been these coalitions that have formed, but I'm questioning it because when you talk about the lives of incarcerated women, you have to look at the disruption that is caused in their lives that doesn't just include sitting on a prison bunk and being incarcerated. There are things going on in this country that are being fueled by, you know, right now, billionaire industrialists that are creating massive disruptions in all other aspects of our lives. And many of these of this kind of free market political agenda has made its way very recently into the criminal justice reform arena. And what it has caused to happen is a dilution of our voices and a dilution of the work that we know needs to happen. We are now talking about reentry. We are now talking about making prisons better. We are now talking about how do we make law enforcement better instead of the issues that were associated with the original intent of justice reinvestment. And that is what we really need to be talking about. There are too many disruptions that are happening in the lives of poor people, that are happening in the lives of poor people of color in general, of the women that we're talking about who land on a prison bunk. And those are really the issues that we have to figure out. How do we get past the niceties, right, of talking about the issues and really get to the core of what we need to do in this country to turn this ship around?
So that's actually a great question. Thanks, Andrea. And that sort of goes to my next question about how we refocus, right? How do we refocus our communities, our societies, to prioritize investments in what we know works and what we know will address some of these underlying causes of the rise in incarceration rates for women, but also for men in this country. And we are now joined happily, hi Vivian, by Vivian Nixon. Vivian, thank you so much for joining us. It was a harrowing trip, I understand.
Well, you know.
But we are so glad you're here. We are so glad you're here. I understand. So actually, before I go there, I'm gonna let Vivian introduce herself and jump into the conversation. But please introduce yourself, your organization, what you all work on, and sort of what brings you to this work.
Thank you so much, Sakira, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Vivian Nixon. I am executive director of an organization called College and Community Fellowship, which started out in 2000 as a very small community-based organization serving women who had been released from prison and during their incarceration had some exposure to higher education, but did not complete a college degree. One of the professors who was teaching in a women's prison in New York State decided that she wanted to make sure that the students she had worked with, who she saw so much promise in, had an opportunity to have the supports that they needed to complete college upon reentry into the community. Over time, that program has expanded to have several different components that include civic engagement, advocacy training, direct policy change at the local, state, and federal level, national technical assistance programs, and career advancements programs so that once our students graduate, they can connect to employment that reflects their level of education. In doing this work, we have recognized that it behooves us to work with families because of the existing and ongoing trauma that people experience due to having criminal justice involvement within the families, whether it started out as being a caretaker of someone in prison or actually being imprisoned. We also noticed that our alumni continue to experience trauma in the workforce, and that is something that is rarely talked about because the number of women who are now engaged in this work in a real and meaningful way at the grassroots level experience trauma on a day-to-day basis related to the work. Like, it is really not easy for me to do this every day. Having spent as much time in prison as I did, having to relive it daily and tell the story daily and deal with other women's trauma daily takes a toll on me as well. So our organization has been very successful in dealing with our work from a trauma-informed lens. Our graduates are graduates. We don't just enroll women in college. We have a 92% success rate. Wow. And over the past 17 years, we've helped more than 400 women earn college degrees and successfully transition into careers that really transform their families. So reentry is not our goal. Our goal is for our families to thrive. And I hope that we can have that conversation today. Absolutely. Thank you.
So that brings us, thanks Vivian for that, and you'll jump right into the conversation as I knew you would. To a question I was just about to pose to the panelists, how do we refocus the justice system to get our families and communities to thrive? How do we have the justice system be a partner in doing that and not so focused on sort of punishment as it has been and focused on building stronger communities, stronger families? What are the inputs that need to happen? What are the things that need to happen for us to do that? So I hope that's a question to all of the panelists, so anyone who wants to jump in first, please do.
From a law enforcement standpoint, from a public safety standpoint, one of the things that has been missing in the conversation is the metrics of how do we assess law enforcement. And I think as we move towards the future is we have to change that we need to assess law enforcement on the absence of crime in their community and their community satisfaction, and on is law enforcement working to make communities whole. And so I think it's a very complicated discussion, and I hear you, Andrea, on the issue of voices being diluted, but I think we also need to, as we evolve further, all of us have to be stakeholders in this process, because there are community members that do want law enforcement there, and we do need to have law enforcement reflect back on, what's their mission. One of the things that I think needs to be done is we need to roll back a lot of the criminal laws. We are over-criminalized in our society. We are over-regulated on issues of, like, traffic fines. I think one of the things, bail reform, is we have a very distinct war, not just on race, but on class and on poverty. And we need to change the justice system. So if you get a traffic ticket, you don't lose your driver's license, you don't get warrants, you don't end up in jail, you don't lose your job because you can't make it. And I think it's very, very complicated, but one of the first and most important things is that we need to, the political issue, and Senator Harrison mentioned, is how do we incentivize law enforcement? I think we need to take drug war incentives away from law enforcement, so in fact they just don't round up people, because that's exactly what we did. We need to, from a law enforcement perspective, recognize the disparities in enforcement, and we need to undo some significant damage that the drug war has caused in our communities. And law enforcement, because we have a significant amount of power, needs to recognize that and needs to apologize for their participation in structural, institutionalized racism and the things that have happened. And so, my hope for the future
is to emphasize smart on crime policies, incentivize law enforcement not to make low-level drug arrests, not to make low-level offender arrests, invest money in families and education, in not removing kids from their parents, but giving them the resources they need to stay with them and stay in that community. And it's incredibly complicated, and I think it's going to take us many years to undo this damage, but we have to have this conversation. I think that's critically important.
I think in communities across this country, predominantly poor communities of color, we have what we call million-dollar blocks. These are blocks where many of you in this room probably have heard the term and are familiar with. In Massachusetts, my home state, we just had Mass Inc. to just lay out a very comprehensive report about the community that I live in, going all the way up the Blue Hill Avenue corridor. These million-dollar blocks are where they spend more than $1 million a year cycling the residents of a single city block in and out of incarceration. We've been dealing with decades of that and the disruption that it's caused in the lives of the residents of these communities and communities, poor communities, predominantly poor communities of color across the country. There is a movement happening in the country within these most vulnerable communities now to begin to map out what this looks like from our perspective. And it starts with having conversations amongst ourselves, kind of closing the doors on our community and looking inside towards ourselves to ask us first, number one, what's happening to us? What are the things that have failed us? What are continuing to fail us? And then not to stop there, but to say, let's look at these things now and say, how would it be different? From our perspective, from the people who are directly affected by this, who are living every single day with a son who's been murdered, with a son who's incarcerated, with a daughter who is dealing with an illness of addiction, all of these levels of difficulty in the lives, and saying how do we begin to turn this around and to map out what that looks like. We call it shifting from a criminal legal system to a human justice system. Mm-hmm. One of those things is actually figuring out how do we create a system that is responsible for ourselves, that does not include law enforcement. Now, it's not to say that we are going to reach a goal of not having law enforcement in our communities, but we are building models now in cities that are practicing the use of citizens engaging with themselves and creating those systems within our communities that would have law enforcement as a last resort. Mm-hmm. When what we're talking about, because of the state that we are currently in our communities, where law enforcement has been the overseer of that. Yep. They have been the ones that have gone in and eroded completely the constitutional right against unreasonable search and seizure. We don't even know what that means in our communities any longer. So we have to figure out ways to think of public safety, but from the terms of the people that live in the households and with our neighbors. And so really, without doing that first, amongst ourselves, within our own communities, and asking ourselves and mapping that out for ourselves, which we are very actively doing at the National Council now, we can't really engage fully in a conversation because you're talking to the same state actors that are talking about the same system that we don't think really, particularly now with the people who are at the table driving criminal justice reform and what we are now being forced to focus on is ever going to get us to a place of change. So it's a radical approach, but it's something that we're not just talking about anymore, we're actually putting it into practice, and it's being led by incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women.
Vivian?
Yeah, so there are a lot of approaches to system change, and I think they're all necessary. But by and large, where criminal justice is concerned, we focused a lot on research. But when you look at movement building and how social change has really happened in the past, it wasn't because one day some, really smart, Ivy League educated PhD came up with a double-blind controlled study that found the answer, right?
Yeah.
Movements have been built by the people most impacted. The women's movement, led by feminists who just decided that they didn't want to be second-class citizens anymore. Gay, lesbian, and LGBTQ communities deciding that they didn't want to be second-class citizens anymore. African Americans decided that they should be able to be voters in the country in which they were citizens. So we have to lead on our own behalf, and I think that Andrea is very right about that. The problem with that is, again, it actually reinduces trauma, because the level of engagement that you have to sustain in order to do this work, and we, as directly impacted people, are always under-resourced with very little capacity and working beyond what is humanly possible for others. The other thing I want to say is that we have systems in place for certain people where law enforcement is not the first response to crime. Wall Street. Let's be real. And it's time for us to have that honest conversation. There are dozens of places where horrendous crimes that impact millions of people, that have global ramifications, do not get responded to by law enforcement interventions. So this is very much about who we choose to punish and why. It is very much about the conscious decision to label some communities as deserving of fair treatment and a second chance and a reasonable doubt that they did not have malintent, and some communities don't get that same consideration. If we don't start there, nothing we do is going to solve this problem.
Thank you. So I want to invite the audience to ask a few questions from our panelists, and then have a few questions. I'll take maybe three, and then I'll ask the panelists to close us out with some final thoughts before we end. So does anyone want to ask? Okay, right here. And please just stand up, say your name, and then speak pretty loud so that we can hear. Oh, great, there's a mic, great.
My name is Amelia Hayden. Thank you for taking time out of your day to come and speak with us. My question is for either Andrea or Vivian. As a Baruca, Afro-Latina with a disability, I'm facing similar issues within my community, and so I'm focusing on the intersex of people of color and disability and how policy and police reform. We recently had a 12-year-old boy who was murdered in my community due to his disability, and he was attacked, and I don't have to get into the details, but I am trying to help my community so that doesn't happen anymore, and educating them, because similar to what we have with the communities of color and people with disabilities, their lives are parallel. We just got deinstitutionalized 27 years ago. The anniversary of the ADA is coming up, where this fear of the stigma of people of color and people of disabilities, the fear of the unknown. What is and Andrea, you spoke to me in the fact when you said, there is nothing about us without us. We need to have a seat at the table. But yet when we're looked at from someone on a holier than art thou podium, we're seen as very less, but I would know my community better than anybody else. You would know the incarcerated community and women of that background better than anybody else versus someone who just opened up a book and read about it. What is your advice to me that I can help my community become more sufficient to where the police don't have to get involved because they are so afraid they're going to lose their lives, especially what has been happening within mainstream media?
Yeah.
Oh, we're going to tag team that one, because thank you for that question, and there's a lot to talk about there. And I just want to say something, just so I'm clear about this, because we have had some incredible allies in the work that we do. We are very outspoken because our voices were not being heard. And we knew that we had a lot to contribute to create the real change that needs to happen. Doing that, though, we had champions who are not formally incarcerated people who have been great allies to us. And I want to say that because often that is something that is not heard coming from me. right? Because right? But I do want to say that, and many of those people are in this space today. I mean, and we're here because of people like Nikichi Taifa and Jesla McCurdy and Sakira and Malika from Google. I mean, there are other women that have brought us into that space. So I would encourage you. I think the best thing that I can say with all of that you have said is that we cannot do this alone. We cannot do this alone. And as we're working very hard to try and raise awareness, because if the will of the people in this country really wanted this to stop, it would stop tomorrow. Yes. Okay? So while we're trying to get the backbone of the American people to stand erect and to take this on, we need to engage, and we unapologetically do our outreach amongst ourselves and organize ourselves as incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women and girls, but we also reach out to women in every single sector, in every single industry, in every single profession, and particularly those women who are, many of them in this room, who are directly connected, not formerly incarcerated, but powerhouses, and directly connected to this work. And when we were sitting on a prison bunk, they were the ones carrying this work, so that when we did begin to organize and raise our voices, we had a platform to speak from. So I don't want you to overlook that, because it's such a big issue that we have to find those people that we can trust to give us the help that we need to really get to meaningful change, right? And continue working amongst yourselves to find out what's the message we actually want to send, and then find those partners that you can trust to help you to deliver that.
I echo everything Andrea just said, but it's really careful. I think the last statement was very critical. Find partners you can trust. Because, I mean, I've been doing this work for 17 years, and there have been some partnerships that actually were harmful, but I think the conversations you need to have with potential partners need to be very honest and explicit about what your needs are and what you expect partnership to look like. Because one of the things that I campaigned against very hard in the early 2000s was this kind of dog and pony show that I would see around this issue, where the credentialed officials, executive directors, and others would be on panels giving the expert advice around what needed to happen in criminal justice reform, and then they would bring out a client only to tell some horror story about what happened to their lives. And I understand that that's a way to gain empathy. It's a way to explain to people the pathway that leads people into the criminal justice system. But I find it so much more empowering to have people speaking their own voice about the actual policies and systems that are impacting their life, and still tell their story at the same time, but have that be a story of a journey from oppression to triumph, rather than just a horror story to gain the sympathy of an audience. So there are different ways to engage people as partners, and I think the last thing that Andrea said, you should take to heart: find partners you can trust.
Yeah, I just want to finish that out, because we do, our national organizer is in the room with us, Topeka Sam. Topeka has a phenomenal across the country panel discussion that she does, and we call it Real Women, Real Voices. But it's different than just talking about all the messy parts of our lives that landed us on a prison bunk. It actually is what we call bringing the people to the policy. So we're using, amongst ourselves, we're talking about the messy parts of our lives, but we're figuring out what does that look like in terms of policy. Right? And then finding those trusted people to help us advance that, to create that change, right?
Thank you. Before we leave this, though, I want to invite both Diane and Elizabeth to speak a little bit to something that she raised, and I think we talked a little bit around it, sort of the intersection of mental illness and women and those who we find to be incarcerated, and how we've seen, I mean, over the last several years, this play out on TV screens across the country, where people who were dealing with mental illness had unfortunate incidents with law enforcement, unfortunately. And again, this goes to the point that we're using law enforcement in inappropriate ways. Why is it a police officer who is going out and sort of interacting with someone who is having a mental health crisis? That isn't they are not trained to do so, and that is not the right person to do so. So if Elizabeth and both Diane can add a little bit to that.
I'll be real quick on that. I think when we start talking about reallocation of fiscal resources, there are many things that I think are critically important. Andrea, you're right. We need to reallocate fiscal resources so communities can have councils and mediators that prevent law enforcement from having to come out for minor things like the dog's barking, the neighbor's too noisy. That's one of the things that I saw in my career. It used to be in communities, people would knock on doors and say, hey, your music's too loud. Instead, now people call law enforcement for it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's wrong. And, I think that's that development of community. So I think your point about taking a community, saying, how can we make this work, and only save law enforcement for really violent public safety issue, which then goes back to my reallocation of resources. I have a dream, which is that we should have mental health workers on 24 hours, and we should have mental health teams that get dispatch out to locations when parents who may have a schizophrenic kid. That should be the first response. And only if it becomes incredibly dangerous, where someone has a weapon or they're violently attacking someone, should then maybe law enforcement come out as well. One of the things that is my background is crisis negotiations, crisis intervention. And one of the things we did in my agency is we mandated department-wide crisis intervention training for all our police officers. And what we saw was a de-escalation of the use of force and more calling of appropriate resources which are better suited. So again, I think this is complicated. I hope for the future that we need police less. That would be my idea of public community health and safety, that we don't have to call law enforcement unless it's really a critically important issue.
And I would just add, so to the question about, the earlier question about investment, and so as I said at Vera, we often partner with county and city governments that are seeking to rethink the way that they're using their jails. And what always strikes me is when it comes to the budget, as it always does, a huge portion of these county and community budgets go towards public safety. And again, that has a different definition to everyone. But oftentimes it's 70, 80% of the county budget is going towards public safety, and a lot of that is to corrections. And so when we talk about investing in the community, or having alternatives or diversion programs or front-end prevention, it's often, but we don't have any community resources. And it strikes me because so much of the community resources are going to corrections.
Correct.
And so I think we really need to rethink how we are using our taxpayer dollars to fund the justice system.
Thank you. Any other questions? Here. Right here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amy Swear, and I thank all of you for sharing your time and your thoughts and your experiences with us. This question is directed more so to Diane, though it is an open question, if anyone else has anything to add, specifically about drug prohibition and what we've been seeing coming out of Portugal in the last 15, 16 years since they've decriminalized all drugs in general, narcotics as well. Specifically, do you see any specific stats coming out in relation to its impact on women in Portugal? And also, do you see the feasibility of similar implementation in the United States?
So I would suggest to everyone who's in this room is the Drug Policy Alliance just released a report very specifically on how the next step in ending drug prohibition in the United States is decriminalization. But let's be clear that that doesn't mean legalization, and it still means that sales. So in Portugal, it's still illegal for people to sell drugs. And so my concern, coming from my perspective, is the violence that's associated with the illicit market is because drugs aren't sensibly controlled and regulated. So yes, I think an incremental step in our society is the full decriminalization of all drugs, where we treat and implement things like heroin-assisted treatment programs, like Switzerland has, where they reduced property crime by, I think it's something like up to 80%, because people who are struggling with chronic substance abuse now go to a doctor for a prescription for synthetic heroin. They go to a safe injection facility that's monitored by health professionals. They've had no overdoses. Welfare has gone down. People are employed. And property crimes went down dramatically because people are no longer having to break into people's houses or cars to steal in order to get their drugs, in order to maintain their health issue. And so decriminalization allows us to continue to push forward on the research and to focus on those harm reduction and public health strategies that we need in order to end the drug war. And so in particular to women, no, I have not seen stats in particular out of Portugal on women in general, but in general, Portugal has been very, very successful because they do exactly all those things that I talked about. Crime's down, murders are down, overdoses are down, but they also heavily invested in social resources. And you can't have decriminalization without that heavy investment into our communities, into drug treatment, into harm reduction strategies, into mental health programs, into job creation. So you can't do one without the other. And that would be my concern, because in America we like quick fixes and we don't invest up front, you know, and so decriminalization isn't a panacea without significant resources into exactly what all my panelists are saying.
I think if I can just add to this, though, something that we have to be concerned about and have to continue to push for legalization, because in particularly communities of color, we were just in a delegation with 6 Latin American countries in Mexico. We were at the UN with Brazil, and these countries are talking about the shift. When you don't straight out legalize drugs, Black people and Black women are then charged with trafficking before they were charged with possession. So for us, it doesn't shift things the way that we would hope decriminalization would shift. And so that's something that we have to recognize. I agree with Diane that it is a step in the right direction. It will get us eventually to legalization, because anytime we begin to talk about something like ending incarceration of women and girls, the dialogue around it increases. When we talk about decriminalization, it helps us, and Neil Franklin speaks about this all the time, about it just helps us to raise the level of dialogue so that we can actually get to talking about things in a way that's going to get us to what we really want, which is the outcome of legalization.
I also think we need to start telling the truth about drugs.
Yes.
Tell the truth about drugs.
And what drugs, who decides what drugs are legal and safe, and why are some drugs legal that actually kill people, and you know, it's really a strange phenomenon. There's a wonderful professor at Columbia, Carl Hart. Yeah, Carl Hart, who is just brilliant.
Say it like Vivian, hot. No.
Hot. I'm from Boston sometimes. That the image that we have of the addict, especially the opioid addict, is, you know, someone nodding and passing out. It is just, once you are addicted to an opioid, you're not taking it to get high. You actually don't get high. You feel normal when you take it. You're able to function. You're able to go to work. You're able to get up in the morning. And without it, you are so sick you can't do any of those things. So we need to start telling the truth about what addiction really looks like, and how there are safe ways to intervene so that people can continue to function. So that's number one. And again, I always say this, in every one of the aspects of this criminalization system we've built in this country, the bottom line is who we think deserves treatment and who we think deserves punishment. We did not see an outcry for decriminalization and legalization during the crack epidemic. But now that the opioid crisis has reached into small towns in rural America, everybody understands that this is an illness that needs to be treated. So let us be really honest about what we're talking about here.
Thank you. So I have to wrap up now because I'm getting the signal. It's kind of like, you know, showtime at the Apollo. But I want to thank my panelists, my esteemed. Please give them a round of applause. Please, thank you. For sharing their thoughts. And I'm going to just do a quick roundup and wrap up because they left us with some really, really, really important things that I think we should sit with. So I want to start with redefining public safety and redefining that, and I think Diane talked about this, to community health and safety that looks at addressing symptoms and the root causes of some of the things that we see in our communities. Centering the voices of women and girls to move policy, not just to share their stories, but to actually move policy to, you know, a better community and a safer community for all of us. Redefining and limiting the role of law enforcement in our community, not having them be the first responders for every issue that comes up in communities, especially in communities of color that are already overly policed and overly surveilled by law enforcement. Addressing structural barriers and structural racism and how those things stemming back from slavery to today and all of the policies and laws that have sort of reciprocated from slavery that have impacted the justice system, basically getting rid of all of those things, okay? Changing bail policies and doing more to have law enforcement assist the diversion programs and pre-booking programs that center and look at the trauma that women, especially women, have experienced when they come into contact with law enforcement. And finally, rethinking how we invest our resources in communities, right? What are we spending $80 billion a year on? We're spending on incarceration. How much are we spending on education? How much are we spending on job growth and opportunity and increasing opportunities for people in our communities? And that's really where justice reinvestment should go. It should not be a choice between law enforcement and communities and investment in communities. And if you look at a community health and safety model instead of sort of public safety, you actually will make the choice to invest in education, to invest in job growth, to invest in the things that we know that work to prevent crime and to have people thrive in their communities. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the